I'm joined now by climatologist from Maynooth University, Professor John Sweeney. John, we see in the VT there the level of destruction caused by Storm Alley for maize farmers, mostly in the Louth, Meath and North Dublin areas over the last week, and the scramble to harvest the crop. Why are we seeing so many extreme weather events? It's been one after another this year.
Well, I think the first thing that we can say is that Ireland's climate has been changing, and whatever you think about the extremes of one year to the next, we can't really argue with thermometers. Every farmer's fields are now half a degree warmer than they were 30 years ago. And one of the things that happens when averages change is that the extremes tend to change more and more quickly and more radically. And what we've seen in Ireland over the past, I suppose, decade or so is an increasing tendency of various extremes. We've seen, for example, the first approach of a near intact hurricane. We've seen an extreme fodder crisis earlier this decade. We're seeing another one now. We've seen an exceptional drought, and we've seen the wettest decade in the past decade that we've had since Irish weather records began. Now, what really is causing this is a source of some controversy, but a lot of people would believe that the jet streams which guide our weather have become more variable and are oscillating more north and south than usual, and this is bringing us extremes of both kinds, sometimes very cold weather like we had last winter, and sometimes the hot, dry kind of conditions that we have this summer. But over a longer period of time, we are experiencing wetter winters and drier summers, which is what the models of climate have been predicting for some time. And I think the reality is, therefore, that we have to face the fact that those kinds of extremes that we're getting now are likely to become more frequent, are likely to become more severe in the future. It doesn't mean they'll happen every year. It doesn't mean they'll happen even every decade, but we are expecting the probability of the kind of weather extremes that we've seen recently increasing as time goes on.
Is climate change solely to blame for this?
No, we've always had extremes. We've had droughts. We now know we've had droughts perhaps more frequently than in the past 40 years. If we go back further, if we go back a century or more, droughts were a more common feature of Irish climate than they have been in the past 30 or 40 years. Any extreme that you see today will undoubtedly have been experienced in the past. So we're not seeing something that we've never experienced in the past, but what we are seeing is something that's more probable to occur in the future. And if you think of, say, the heat wave that we had in the early part of this summer, we can now look at the climate change models that we run of the atmosphere, and we now have the computing power to run those models not just once like we did in the past, but maybe hundreds or thousands of times. And we can say, okay, let's run it without climate change impacts from carbon dioxide. Let's run it with carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. What's the change in frequency that will occur with that particular extreme? And in the case of our heat wave this year, for example, we know that the probability was doubled, is doubled now than what it was in the past. So those are the kinds of modelling outputs which give us confidence that climate change is driving the frequency of extremes. But of course, from year to year, we will have events which we can't attribute to climate change completely or even substantially, but we can say that climate change is driving a more variable climate, and climate change therefore is telling us that we have, as farmers, for example, to be much more cautious in how we approach the future to enable us to be competitive.
What would you propose there in terms of risk management on farms to deal with such extreme events?
Well, I think that farmers they are themselves, I think, great stewards of the landscape, and there's no group in society better equipped to handle weather and understand weather and how it impacts on their livelihood than farmers. And I think over time we've seen that farmers, they react and they respond to things that are changing. They will know, for example, at the moment that our warming has produced slightly longer growing seasons for them in terms of grass and other crops. They will know also that the year-to-year variability has increased. What I would think that farmers have to do is perhaps be more cautious about not taking chances, not gambling on a continuation of the kind of conditions maybe that they grew up with 20, 30, 40 years ago. And that means, for example, maybe having a bit more reserve in terms of especially fodder for the future. We've seen the number of cattle in Ireland since 2011, for example, increase by 750,000. And that is obviously cattle that are grazing lands that could have been kept a bit more for maybe having that safety reserve for fodder in years like today. So I think we have to question whether or not we can go down the road of continuously increasing our cattle numbers at the expense of having that insurance policy for fodder, especially in the years ahead. And also, of course, looking at opportunities, and the opportunities that will arise will be maybe to change the model of some of the crops we grow. Maize, for example, you mentioned maize is one of the crops which will do very well in Ireland's future climate, and is a more nutritious crop for feeding cattle than, for example, silage. So maybe there's a change in practice required as well to make the opportunities which climate change gives Irish farming perhaps make them more exploitable than we have in the past.
And what about when it comes to investing in expanding a farming enterprise, investing in new technologies? Is the weather and potential significant weather events something that farmers should also consider when they're budgeting for such investment?
I think so, and I think also they should be considering what is likely to be coming down the road in terms of impositions from the national government and from Brussels in terms of the technology that will be acceptable. And one good example I can think of is a splash plate spreading of slurry is something that I wouldn't be investing in, for example, in Ireland in the future. I think we're going to face a lot of calls for removing that and not spraying ammonia into the atmosphere the way we do, because we're at the limit of what we're allowed to do in Europe as well. So I think we have to bear in mind the technologies which will enable us to meet the obligations which are going to come from Europe and indeed from our own national government in many key areas to enable Irish agriculture to be more compliant with the obligations that we have signed up to in terms of climate change.
And of course, as you mentioned, farmers are the custodians of the land and they take their environmental responsibilities very seriously. And on the dairy side, we are the most carbon efficient in Europe. On the beef side, we are the 5th most efficient. Do you think that agriculture is unfairly targeted in some ways on that argument?
Well, you mentioned efficiency, but efficiency is not something that the atmosphere recognises in any way. Efficiency in terms of greenhouse gases per kilogram of beef is not a statistic that the atmosphere recognises. All it recognises is how much kilograms of greenhouse gases are going into the atmosphere. So if we're increasing the kilograms of beef hugely, we're undoing the benefits of that increased efficiency. So I think we simply cannot get away from the fact that in terms of the amounts of greenhouse gases per calorie of food we produce, we are the 2nd least efficient producer in Europe, not the most efficient. So we do need to look simply at the greenhouse gas emissions total, and that's very substantially increased in agriculture. It's gone up by 10% since 2012, and it's continuing to rise and expected to rise at the moment till 2030. And I think farmers have to be conscious of the fact that society may not stand for that, quite simply. They may well seek that the burden of controlling emissions should also be borne by the farming community more overtly than they do at the moment. So I think there is a crunch coming for the model of Irish agriculture. Our greenhouse gas emissions per cow even are increasing because of the increased intensity of feedstock and so on that we give each animal. So I think that we do have to face the reality that farmers, as was called for in the Citizens' Assembly, will have to maybe change the model and question whether Food-Wise 2025 is the way to go. Now, there's also, of course, two sides to this argument, and the other side is that some farmers have been doing very well, as you say, in dairying, where 1/3 of dairy farmers last year earned over €100,000, and the average dairy income was around €86,000, I think. So that was a very good year, and they've had bad years, and obviously there is problems with investment in infrastructure. But we do need to look after the family farm, and we need to get back to the basics of what the Common Agricultural Policy was established for. It wasn't just purely food security, it was to enable rural development and rural vibrancy to continue in Europe. And to some extent we've lost the vision of using agriculture as a means of maintaining a healthy rural landscape and rural economy, especially for poorer farmers and for middle income farmers, which have been largely bypassed in the more recent CAP negotiations.
John, if I could just bring you back to the weather issue again, do you think that the weather warning system that's currently in place is working? Is there sufficient time there for farmers to make the necessary moves to protect their crops? As we can see from the maize farmers, from the VT, that it wasn't enough time, they didn't have enough warning.
Storm Alley caught a lot of people by surprise, there's no doubt about it. It especially caught people by surprise in the strength of the gusts in the Midlands and even in the east of Ireland. We had a gust of 143 kilometres an hour in West Galway, which is an exceptional event. But thereafter, the gust speeds were of the orange warning category, which Met Éireann complies with in accordance with its European criteria. But I think it's fair to say that there will be events which will always catch us by surprise. Some depressions can deepen explosively, extremely quickly. And it would appear to me that Storm Alley was one of those categories where the deepening that occurred, the rapid intensification that occurred, was something that maybe caught forecasters a bit by surprise. But I think it's also true to say that that will always happen. Farmers do need to pay very close attention to Met Éireann as the main authority in forecasting in this country, and not to be, I suppose, inured by warnings, because we can get warning fatigue, of course, after a while. And I think that's something that farmers above all should try and guard against. And if there is a yellow or an orange warning, then I think it's incumbent on farmers to take that very seriously indeed and do what protection measures they can. And of course it's limited in many ways as to what people can do in the rural communities to protect themselves, but there are things they can do which should be taken very seriously.
We'll leave it there, John. Thank you very much for joining us